All right, let's go. Number 10. Von der Heydte, the paratroop baron. In December 1944, as the last great German offensive of the war roared through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, a Fallschirmjäger officer climbed into a transport aircraft with a broken arm, a handful of paratroopers, and orders that were almost certainly suicidal. Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte, commander of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, was going to drop behind Allied lines in the dark, in a blizzard, and somehow tie the whole operation together. Von der Heydte was already a decorated veteran of some of the war's most ferocious fighting. He had led his battalion through the Battle of Crete in May 1941, capturing Heraklion against British defenders who outnumbered his forces significantly, and he had earned the Knight's Cross with oak leaves through a career of relentless, audacious command that most officers half his age would not have survived. Operation Stusser called for 870 paratroopers to drop and seize key road junctions ahead of the armored assault. The weather was catastrophic, and the pilots were inexperienced. Fewer than 300 men landed anywhere near the target. Von der Heydte gathered what he could find, fractured arm and all, and fought on for days in the snow rather than surrender or withdraw. He finally gave himself up to American forces on December 21st, 1944, frostbitten, exhausted, and still dangerous. His capture required no dramatic firefight. He simply concluded that continuing to fight with a broken battalion in a blizzard served no further purpose, and so he stopped. After the war, this ferocious paratroop commander became a professor of international law, spending decades arguing that armed conflict violated the fundamental rights of human beings. History rarely produces ironies quite that complete. Number 9. Onoda, the war that never ended. On March 9, 1974, a Japanese soldier stepped out of the Philippine jungle on the island of Lubang and formally surrendered his samurai sword to President Ferdinand Marcos. He was trim, disciplined, and stood at rigid attention. Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda of the Imperial Japanese Army had been fighting, without pause, for 29 years. The Second World War had ended in August 1945. Nobody had told him in a way that he was prepared to believe. Onoda had arrived on Lubang in December 1944 with orders from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi of the 8th Division. Hold your position, continue your mission, never surrender, never take your own life. Taniguchi had been entirely serious, and Onoda was entirely obedient. When leaflets were dropped over the jungle announcing the Japanese surrender, Onoda concluded they were Allied propaganda. When his own family sent letters and photographs, he concluded they had been coerced. For nearly 3 decades, Onoda led a small guerrilla cell through the Philippine jungle, conducting raids, ambushing patrols, and engaging Philippine constabulary forces. His last remaining comrade, Kinshichi Kozuka, was killed in a firefight with Philippine police in October 1972. By the time a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki located Onoda in the jungle 2 years later, Onoda's campaign had cost approximately 30 Filipino lives. Suzuki could not convince him to stop. Only one thing could. Anthropic flew in Major Taniguchi, now a civilian bookseller, to personally relieve Onoda of his duty. Taniguchi read the formal order. Onoda stood to attention, wept briefly, and walked out of the jungle. Onoda didn't lose his war. The war lost him. Number 8. Sterling, the Phantom Major. In the summer of 1941, a junior British officer, recovering from a parachute accident that had temporarily paralyzed his legs, dragged himself past the sentries of Middle East headquarters in Cairo on a pair of crutches, made his way through corridors he had no authorization to enter, and placed a handwritten memo on the desk of General Claude Auchinleck. Lieutenant David Sterling of the Scots Guards proposed something that no army had formally attempted: small, autonomous raiding teams, inserted deep behind enemy lines to destroy what could not be reached by conventional forces. Auchinleck read the memo and approved it. The Special Air Service was born. What followed was one of the most effective small unit campaigns in the history of warfare, conducted across thousands of miles of North African desert against an enemy that significantly outnumbered and outgunned every raiding party Sterling ever sent out. Between the SAS's first operations in mid-1941 and Sterling's capture in January 1943, his teams destroyed more Axis aircraft on the ground than the RAF shot down over the western desert in the same period. Estimates range from 250 to close to 400 aircraft eliminated in raids on airfields at Benghazi, Tobruk, and across Libya. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who did not give compliments carelessly, called Sterling the very able and adaptable commander of the Desert Group, which caused us more damage than any other British unit of equal strength, and ordered his capture as a personal priority. Sterling was betrayed by local guides near Gabes, Tunisia, in January 1943, and subsequently escaped from 3 separate prisoner of war camps before being sent to Colditz Castle, where even he could not get out. If a single officer with a crutch and a memo could reshape how the world's armies fight wars, it raises a question about where real power actually lives, and it has almost nothing to do with rank. Number 7. Skorzeny, Hitler's most dangerous man. On September 12, 1943, 12 German gliders crash-landed on a mountain plateau in the Apennines at 6,000 feet. The men inside had roughly 4 minutes before the guards at the Campo Imperatore Hotel could organize a coherent defense. Hauptsturmführer Otto Skorzeny, a 6'4" Viennese officer with a dueling scar across his left cheek, had planned for exactly that. In under 4 minutes, his commandos had neutralized 200 Carabinieri guards without firing a single shot, and Benito Mussolini declared the most securely held prisoner in Europe was on his way to freedom. Mussolini had been arrested in July 1943 and held at a series of increasingly remote locations as the Italian government tried to keep him beyond German reach. The Campo Imperatore was the final option, a ski resort accessible only by cable car, perched on the Gran Sasso Massif in central Italy. German intelligence had found him anyway, and Skorzeny had designed a plan that depended entirely on speed and the psychological paralysis of men who simply could not believe what was happening to them. Operation Heydte, Oak, was the most audacious Special Forces rescue in the Second World War. But Skorzeny was not finished. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, he commanded German soldiers in American uniforms, driving captured American vehicles behind Allied lines during Operation Grief. The operational damage was modest. The psychological damage was enormous. Allied command erupted in paranoia. False intelligence suggested Skorzeny had orders to assassinate General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe was confined to his headquarters for weeks, surrounded by bodyguards, while his officers chased shadows across the continent. Skorzeny never needed an army. He only needed the world to believe he might show up anywhere. Number 6. Puller, the Marine's Marine. On the night of October 24, 1942, on the island of Guadalcanal in the South Pacific, a Japanese regiment numbering approximately 2,500 soldiers launched a coordinated assault on the American perimeter, defending Henderson Field. The airfield was the strategic heart of the entire Guadalcanal campaign, and losing it would have been catastrophic. Standing between that regiment and the airfield was Lieutenant Colonel Louis Burwell Puller, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, with fewer than 700 men and a perimeter that was already stretched to breaking point. Puller was not a man who commanded from behind maps. He walked the entire perimeter under fire that night, personally assessing every position, moving between his machine gun nests in the darkness as the Japanese assault broke in waves against his line. When a section of the perimeter collapsed, he was there. When ammunition ran low, he organized the resupply personally. His men did not follow orders that night. They followed him. By dawn, the regimental assault had been broken. More than 1,400 Japanese soldiers were dead in front of Puller's positions. His own casualties were significant, but the line had held, and Henderson Field remained in American hands. It was the kind of night that military historians write entire books about. Puller had already won one Navy Cross in Nicaragua in 1930, fighting guerrilla forces with the Guardia Nacional. He would go on to win 4 more at Cape Gloucester, Palaleu, and the frozen horror of the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, where his surrounded regiment's fighting breakout became one of the most celebrated tactical retreats in military history. 5 Navy Crosses. No other Marine in the history of the United States has won more than 3. Not one of the citations uses the word reckless, because every single time, it worked. Number 5. Basilone, Manila John. On the same October night in 1942 that Puller held the northern perimeter at Guadalcanal, a different fight was burning on the southern end of Henderson Field. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, was holding a section of line against a Japanese force that had already overwhelmed the positions on either side of him. By the midpoint of the night, most of his men were dead or wounded. Basilone was effectively alone, and the assault was not stopping. Basilone had 2 water-cooled M1917 Browning machine guns. When one jammed under the rate of fire, he repaired it in the dark while the attack continued around him. When his ammunition ran out, he physically carried a weapon and supplies through enemy-held ground to resupply his own position. The M1917, with its tripod, weighed approximately 100 pounds. He did not stop to consider whether this was a reasonable thing to attempt. By morning, the ground in front of Basilone's section of the line was so thick with Japanese dead that the Marines spent the following day clearing bodies. After-action assessments of his specific sector cited over 900 enemy killed. His Medal of Honor citation described him as holding his position against numerically superior forces through an outstanding display of bravery and intrepidity. The language is formal. The reality behind it is almost beyond description. America made Basilone famous. He toured the country selling war bonds. He was offered a commission, a safe posting as an instructor, a future well away from the front. He turned all of it down and requested return to combat. He landed on the beach at Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, leading his men off the sand under fire. He was killed that morning, aged 28, and was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his actions on the day of his death. He could have spent the rest of the war signing autographs. The fact that he chose the beach at Iwo Jima instead tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man John Basilone was. Number 4. Pavlichenko, Lady Death. By the summer of 1942, the Nazi High Command had attempted to neutralize a single Soviet soldier through artillery bombardment, counter-sniper operations, and at least one direct assassination attempt. All of them failed. Senior Lieutenant Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko of the 25th Rifle Division had 309 confirmed kills recorded in official Soviet military records, making her the most lethal female sniper in the history of warfare, and among the highest confirmed kill snipers of either gender in any conflict ever fought. Pavlichenko had enrolled at Kiev University to study history when the German invasion began in June 1941. She joined the Red Army almost immediately, and by the time she was deployed to the defense of Odessa that August, she had already demonstrated a capacity for the work that unsettled, even experienced soldiers around her. Snipers hunt human beings, patiently and precisely, from concealment. Pavlichenko was extraordinarily good at it. She served through the brutal siege of Sevastopol from October 1941 onward, operating in conditions of almost continuous combat. Of her 309 confirmed kills, 36 were enemy snipers, men who were simultaneously hunting her, men who were specifically trained to find and eliminate exactly the kind of threat she represented. She found them first, consistently and without exception. In June 1942, a mortar fragment struck her face, and she was evacuated from frontline duty. The Soviet government sent her on a goodwill tour to the United States and Canada, where she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt described her as one of the greatest women she had ever met. When American crowds treated Pavlichenko as a celebrity curiosity, she responded with ice-cold precision. "I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long? When the Germans named her Lady Death, they intended it as psychological warfare. It became the most accurate military assessment they ever produced. Number 3. Zaitsev, the hare who hunted wolves. In the autumn of 1942, the German High Command took a step that had no precedent in the war on the Eastern Front. They flew their most decorated sniper instructor to Stalingrad with a single operational priority: locate and kill one Soviet soldier. The soldier in question was Senior Lieutenant Vasily Grigorievich Zaitsev of the 284th Rifle Division, a shepherd's grandson from the Ural Mountains, whose surname, in Russian, means hare. By October 1942, he had accumulated over 140 confirmed kills in the rubble of Stalingrad. The Germans sent a wolf to catch the hare. The city of Stalingrad had ceased to exist in any conventional sense. What remained was a frozen, shattered labyrinth of collapsed buildings, exposed girders, and frozen ground that offered concealment and death in approximately equal measure. Zaitsev had grown up hunting rabbits in the Ural Mountains, under conditions that taught him patience, stillness, and the precise calculation of angles and distances. He applied every lesson to the ruins around him. The German sniper, identified in Soviet records as Major Koenig, and believed by some historians to be Heinz Thorwald, head of the Wehrmacht sniper school at Sossen, was a formidable opponent. The duel between them lasted several days. Both men lay motionless for hours at a time, reading the ground, refusing to reveal their position through any movement or mistake. Zaitsev finally drew Koenig into exposing his position and killed him with a single shot to the head. Soviet military historians documented the engagement in detail, though the precise identity of the German sniper remains disputed. Zaitsev was temporarily blinded by a mortar explosion in January 1943 and evacuated to Moscow, where Dr. Vladimir Filatov restored his sight. He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union on February 22, 1943, and returned to combat at the Battle of the Dnieper before the war's end. In a battle that consumed over 1 million lives, both sides fixated on the death of a single man. That fact alone tells you something profound about what human beings are actually afraid of in war, and it is not always the army in front of them. Number 2. Murphy, the most decorated. On January 26, 1945, near the French village of Holzwihr in Alsace, 2nd Lieutenant Audie Leon Murphy of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, ordered his men to withdraw into the tree line behind him. Then he climbed on top of a burning M10 tank destroyer, a vehicle that had already been hit by German fire and whose fuel and ammunition were cooking off around him, took hold of its 50 caliber machine gun and began firing at a German force consisting of 6 tanks and approximately 250 infantry soldiers. He was alone. He was wounded. He held that position for nearly 50 minutes. Murphy had enlisted in the United States Army at 17 years old after being rejected by the Marine Corps for being underweight and underage. He stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed approximately 112 pounds at enlistment. By January 1945, he had already been decorated multiple times for actions in Sicily, Italy, and France, and had been wounded twice. His commanding officers described him as instinctively and almost incomprehensibly brave. The action at Holzwihr was something beyond that. While standing on a burning vehicle that could have detonated at any moment, Murphy called in artillery coordinates that included his own position. He directed fire onto the ground around him as a controlled method of breaking the German assault. The combination of his machine gun fire and the artillery he directed killed or wounded enough of the attacking force to halt their advance. He then climbed down from the tank destroyer, wounded and bleeding, walked back to his men in the tree line, and led a counterattack that drove the remaining German forces back. Audie Murphy received 33 individual awards and decorations for his service in the Second World War, including the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Légion d'honneur from France, and the Croix de Guerre, with palm. He is the most decorated American combat soldier in the history of the United States military. He never spoke easily about what the war had cost him. In the years that followed, he became one of the first public figures in America to speak openly about what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, describing nightmares and a permanent inability to feel safe that no medal had resolved. The bravest soldier in the American Army spent the rest of his life trying to explain that bravery and damage are not opposites. They are, very often, the same thing. Number 1. Churchill, the Last Knight. In the spring of 1940, as the German Wehrmacht rolled through Western Europe with armored divisions, dive bombers, and the most mechanized military force the world had ever seen, a British Army officer named Lieutenant Jack Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill was preparing for combat. He brought with him a Scottish broadsword, a longbow, and a quiver of arrows. He was entirely serious. He would use all of them in battle, and he would terrify people with every single one. Churchill had been a professional soldier, an actor, a film extra, and a competitive archer who had represented Great Britain in the 1939 World Archery Championships. When the war began, he did not update his approach to killing. At the action at Lepinette in France on May 27, 1940, Churchill became the only British soldier in the Second World War to kill an enemy combatant with a longbow arrow, cutting down a German sergeant at a range that military historians have cited as extraordinary. He then continued the engagement with his broadsword and his service rifle, apparently seeing no contradiction between these three methods of warfare. This was not eccentricity. Churchill believed, and his combat record proved, that a man who was psychologically unyielding and physically fearless could do things to an enemy's morale that no weapon in any army's inventory could replicate. In 1941 in Yugoslavia, he led a raid at Salerno that captured 42 German prisoners. He did part of this with his sword. In 1943 in Italy, he led his commando unit up a hillside at night playing the bagpipes, was seriously wounded when his entire unit was killed or captured by German forces, and survived. He survived a German grenade that knocked him unconscious and should have killed him. He survived the concentration camp at Sachsenhausen. He survived a forced march through the Austrian Tyrol and eventually escaped his captors alone, walking toward American lines. When the war in Europe ended, Churchill expressed disappointment. He reportedly said that the war would have lasted longer if the Americans had not got involved. He then requested transfer to the Pacific Theater. Jack Churchill was ferocious, indomitable, and somewhere beyond the reach of what most human beings understand as fear. He fought the most mechanized war in history with a medieval sword and a longbow, and emerged from it having killed the enemy, captured the enemy, survived the enemy's camps, and escaped the enemy's custody. He was not a relic of another era. He was a reminder that no army in history has ever invented a weapon more formidable than a human being who has simply decided not to stop. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.